Nigeria has had many leaders, but only a few ruled with as much controversy as General Sani Abacha. His 4.5-year reign from November 17, 1993 to June 8, 1998 was not just oppressive, it was outright illegal. The people had spoken in Nigeria's freest and fairest election on June 12, 1993, but their voices were silenced. A coup, a stolen mandate, and a reign of absolute power followed. Abacha dissolved democratic institutions, ruled by decrees, and crushed anyone who stood in his way. The courts, powerless. The press, gagged. Political opponents, jailed, or worse, killed. General Sani Abacha's rule turned Nigeria into an international pariah, infamous for human rights abuses, corruption, and state-sponsored repression. But like all dictatorships, it could not last forever. His end came suddenly, but the scars of his rule still linger. So, how was Abacha's regime illegal? This is the full story. When Major General Ibrahim Babangida orchestrated the Palace Coup of August 27, 1985, which saw the overthrow of Major General Muhammadu Buhari, few figures benefited more than Sani Abacha. As the General Officer commanding GOC, the Nigerian Army's 2nd Division, Abacha was rewarded with the powerful position of Chief of Army Staff, the very office Babangida himself had used as a stepping stone to seize power. Some sources claim that Abacha had negotiated the appointment as a condition for supporting the coup, demonstrating his political instincts even at that early stage. But despite his rapid ascent, Abacha was not widely respected within military circles. He was seen as an uninspiring officer, dull, unmotivated, and disorganized. His colleagues whispered about his habitual lateness, disdain for staff meetings, and eccentric personal interests, which often took precedence over professional duties. Rumors swirled that he had barely escaped through Staff College at Jaji, that his confidential reports were unimpressive, and that he had been saved from early retirement more than once. Despite these shortcomings, Abacha had a knack for being in the right place at the right time. His ruthless efficiency in coup plotting made him indispensable in both the December 1983 and August 1985 takeovers. In an era where loyalty to the coup circle was more valuable than competence, this was all that mattered. His reputation, however, was not without blemish. One particularly controversial episode occurred in the late 1970s when Abacha, as brigade commander in Port Harcourt, found himself in a violent clash with the Nigerian police. While this incident could have derailed his career, his involvement in subsequent coups ensured his survival. By the time he became Chief of Army Staff in 1985 in the new Babangida regime, Abacha wasted little time consolidating his influence. According to accounts, he quickly strong-armed both local and foreign military contractors into deals that benefited him personally. His motivation, some believed, stemmed from a desire to compete financially with his mentor-turned-rival Babangida, who had previously held the same office. His obsession with amassing wealth defined much of his career. Why he felt the need to stockpile vast sums remains a mystery, but it shaped his leadership style. His paranoia extended beyond financial security. He was fiercely protective of state security and had little tolerance for disloyalty within the army. This attitude was on full display in March 1986 when he played a key role in the decision to execute General Mamavatsa and other alleged coup plotters, despite intense domestic and international pressure for clemency. Abacha's lack of leadership skills eventually eroded his standing among the younger officers who had helped bring Babangida to power. Resentment simmered within the ranks, with some seeing him as an obstacle to professionalizing the military. Before long, murmurs grew louder that Abacha should be removed as Chief of Army Staff. Several ambitious senior officers, particularly Brigadier Joshua Dongoyaro, began eyeing his position. At the same time, officers from the Nigerian Defense Academy's Regular One course, including Saliu Ibrahim, Aliyu Gusso, and Oladipo Dia, started lobbying for a shift in army leadership, seeking to replace foreign-trained officers with their own. Feeling the pressure, Abacha accused Babangida of deliberately underfunding the army to weaken his influence. This situation became so tense that a secret meeting was held at Ikeja cantonment to diffuse tensions. Ultimately, special financial arrangements were made to appease Abacha, allowing funds to bypass traditional military channels and flow directly to operational units. Despite these temporary fixes, the demand for Abacha's removal persisted. Babangida then devised a two-step strategy to push him out. The first move was the removal of Lieutenant General Dom Katzbali, a respected officer serving as Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Minister of Defense. In December 1989, Babangida assumed the position of Defense Minister, while Abacha was allowed to hold both his existing role as Chief of Army Staff and Bali's vacated seat as Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. The second step was designed to shift Abacha into a purely political role, making him Defense Minister in exchange for vacating his military command. But before Babangida could fully implement his plan, unforeseen complications arose. Bali's removal triggered backlash within the military, particularly over concerns about religious balance in leadership. When Babangida attempted to redeploy Bali to the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the general refused outright and instead chose to retire within 10 days. Before Babangida could recover, another crisis struck. On April 22, 1990, a group of disgruntled senior officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Inyam, Major Saliba Mkoro, and Major Gideon Oka staged a failed coup attempt, citing the mishandling of General Dom Katzbali's removal as one of their grievances. Abacha, still Chief of Army Staff, played a critical role in rallying the military to crush the rebellion. His swift response and calm radio broadcast after the coup attempt earned him immense political capital. Suddenly, he was no longer just Babangida's right-hand man. He now had his own power base. The Abacha boys began to emerge, a loyal faction distinct from Babangida's inner circle, composed of officers from Kano and the surrounding northwest. Although Babangida revived his plan to replace Abacha, the latter had now become too powerful to sideline easily. In September 1990, Babangida made his next move, replacing himself as defense minister with Abacha, allowing him to focus on the broader government. Some believed this was a calculated decision, giving Abacha free rein over defense funds, while Babangida retained ultimate political control. To prevent another ambitious coup plotter from rising, Babangida overlooked Joshua Dongoyaro for the Chief of Army Staff role and instead appointed Major General Saliu Ibrahim, a respected but politically neutral officer. Dongoyaro was then sent to command Ecomog in Liberia, a convenient way to keep him out of domestic politics. For the next few years, Abacha solidified his grip, holding on to the dual roles of Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Defense Minister until August 1993. By then, Babangida himself was on borrowed time. As Nigeria's political crisis deepened following the annulment of the June 12 election, it became increasingly clear that the future belonged not to Babangida, but to the man he had once sought to sideline, Sani Abacha. Many historians have meticulously chronicled the endless transition and political maneuvering of the Babangida regime. The shifting deadlines for the transfer of power from 1990 to 1992 and then to 1993 paints a picture of deliberate delay. Yet, behind the scenes, one man lurked in the shadows, silently pulling strings and shaping events: General Sani Abacha. The groundwork for this convoluted transition was laid as early as 1986 with the establishment of the Political Bureau, which produced a report that led to the formation of a two-party system in October 1989. These parties, the National Republican Convention (NRC) and the Social Democratic Party (SDP), were state-sponsored, with the governments dictating their constitutions and funding. The legal framework was set by the 1989 Constitution, also known as Decree No. 12 of 1989, which was shaped by a Constitution Review Committee, ratified by the Constituent Assembly, and ultimately amended by the Armed Forces Ruling Council (AFRC). Among the AFRC's 11 amendments, 3 were particularly significant for defense and security. One stripped the National Assembly of its oversight on national security, citing concerns that such powers would render the government weak in the face of threats. Another scrapped the provision for an Armed Forces Service Commission, which was meant to enforce the federal character principle in military appointments. Most crucially, the FRC removed a section that would have made coup plotting a crime, effectively leaving the door open for future military interventions. Initially, Decree No. 25 of 1987, later amended by Decree No. 9 of 1989, barred past politicians and high-ranking officials found guilty of misconduct from re-entering the political arena. Yet, under mounting pressure from influential northern elders, these restrictions were repealed in December 1991, ostensibly to ensure inclusivity for all ethnic groups. A similar pattern emerged with the presidential election timeline. Initially slated for November 1992 under Decree No. 19 of 1987 and later modified by Decree No. 26 of 1989, the election process was upended when allegations of malpractice led to the cancellation of the September 1992 party primaries. Major contenders were sidelined and the timetable was again pushed to 1993, with party structures dismantled and replaced by government-appointed caretakers. At the heart of these endless postponements was Babangida's deep-seated fear of powerful financially independent politicians. His ultimate goal was to populate government offices with a new breed of controllable politicians, effectively laying the foundation for a hybrid civilian-military government, one that he would continue to dominate from the center. This fear drove the systematic exclusion of strong candidates from the process. Among those banned following the annulment of the 1992 primaries were retired Major General Shehu Musa Yar'Adua, who had secured the SDP nomination, and Chief Olufalaye. On the NRC side, Adamu Shiroma and Umaru Shinkafi were set to face off in a runoff before they too were disqualified. Amidst this political turbulence, Babangida made another strategic move. On November 17, 1992, he dissolved the FRC, creating a vacuum before unveiling the National Defense and Security Council (NDSC) on January 2, 1993. To boost public trust in the transition, a civilian transitional council was established, chaired by Chief Ernest Shonekan, who was also designated head of government. This council, empowered by Decree No. 54 of 1992, was to work alongside the NDSC to ensure a seamless transfer of power. It was against this backdrop that the final presidential candidates, Alhaji Bashir Othman Tofa of the NRC and Chief Moshood Kashima Wolawale MKO Abiola of the SDP, emerged. Abacha, though outwardly uninvolved, was watching closely. He later confided to associates that Babangida had entertained the idea of ruling Nigeria for 30 years. When Abiola first declared his presidential ambitions, a faction of Babangida's military loyalists, including Abacha, sought ways to prevent his participation. Babangida, however, dismissed these concerns, relying on a security report that wrongly predicted that Abiola's rival, Alhaji Babangida Kingibe, would secure the SDP nomination. He assured his military caucus that Abiola posed no threat, while simultaneously reassuring Abiola that he was free to contest. At no point, it seemed, did Babangida disclose to either side the full extent of his double dealing. Interestingly, Abiola was not a stranger to the inner workings of Babangida's military clique. He had long-standing ties with many officers, some as business associates, others as beneficiaries of his financial support during previous coups, notably those of 1983 and 1985. To the dismay of Abacha and other opposed officers, Abiola narrowly clinched the SDP nomination, overcoming fierce opposition from several governors and former aspirants. Reports soon surfaced alleging widespread vote buying, prompting Abacha's faction to press Babangida to use these claims as grounds for disqualifying Abiola and halting the elections. As the June 12, 1993 presidential election loomed, tension mounted. Anti-military sentiment among students and labor unions was at an all-time high, and public doubts over the regime's commitment to relinquishing power was growing. Former head of state General Olusegun Obasanjo and political leader Chief Anthony Enahoro openly questioned the sincerity of the military's exit plans. Babangida found himself in a dangerous position, balancing public suspicion against internal pressure from elements within his military circle who wanted the transition derailed once more. Ultimately, he resisted these pressures and allowed the process to continue. However, the military was far from unified in its stance. Some senior officers such as Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, General Ishola Williams, Brigadier MC Ali, and Colonel Abubakar Umar genuinely supported military disengagements from politics. Others, including Lieutenant General Oladipo Oduya, were said to be undecided. Meanwhile, a faction of staunch Babangida loyalists comprising Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro, Brigadiers David Mark, Stephen Anthony Okpo, John Shagaya, and Halilu Akilu were unwilling to cede power under any circumstances. Abacha, ever the enigma, played his cards with calculated precision. At senior officers' meetings, he rarely voiced his opinions. Instead, he preferred private discussions with Babangida, all the while discreetly cultivating relationships with civilian leaders opposed to both the elections and Abiola himself. To the uninitiated, he presented himself as the regime's pillar of stability. Beyond the military, other powerful civilian voices also sought to undermine the elections. The then Sultan of Sokoto, Ibrahim Dasuki, along with several northern emirs, reportedly harbored deep reservations about both Tofa and Abiola. Disqualified politicians such as Shehu Yar'Adua and Abubakar Rimi saw an opportunity to disrupt a process that had excluded them. Even Tofa, the NRC candidate, lent his voice to those calling for a boycott, an irony not lost on political observers. The most audacious intervention came from the Association for Better Nigeria, a pro-military advocacy group that campaigned for the regime's indefinite stay in power. Despite mounting domestic opposition, international actors including Britain and the United States strongly backed a military withdrawal. Yet, on June 10, 1993, Justice Basi Ekpeme of the Abuja High Court, invoking Decree No. 13 of 1993 and Decree No. 19 of 1987, issued an order barring the National Electoral Commission (NEC) from conducting the election. Babangida, citing jurisdictional overreach, initially dismissed the ruling, allowing the polls to proceed 2 days later, on June 12. The election was later widely regarded as the freest and fairest in Nigeria's history. But the drama was far from over, and lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, was Sani Abacha. On June 16, 1993, with the results from 14 of Nigeria's 30 states already known, Professor Humphrey Nwosu, the chairman of the National Electoral Commission (NEC), abruptly announced the suspension of other election results declarations. The emerging figures strongly indicated that Chief Moshood Abiola was on course for victory, yet legal challenges from lower court injunctions loomed. Despite this, a pressure group known as the Campaign for Democracy (CD) later released what it claimed to be the full election results, showing Abiola had secured the majority votes in 19 states, while his opponent Bashar Tofa had won in 11. However, behind the scenes, powerful factions within the military were in turmoil. General Ibrahim Babangida, sensing the escalating crisis, retreated from Abuja to Minna, where he consulted members of his original 1985 coup circle. Many within this group, including General Sani Abacha, were disappointed. They had been assured that Abiola would never emerge as a candidate from the SDP convention in Jos, yet here he was on the verge of assuming the presidency. The situation presented Babangida with an ultimatum: either annul the election or step down voluntarily. Failure to do either, some warned, might result in dire consequences for both him and Abiola. Amidst these high-stakes deliberations, misinformation circulated, fueling anxiety. Allegations surfaced that if Abiola assumed office, he would purge the military, relocate the capital back to Lagos, and enact policies that threatened entrenched interests. Some argued that his presidency would dismantle the legacy of Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto, and shift political power to an ethnic group already dominant in the economy. Others raised concerns about Abiola's business empire, his numerous wives and concubines, and the federal government's outstanding debts to him, claims designed to paint him as unsuitable for leadership. Further complicating matters was the controversy surrounding the SDP convention in Jos, where Abiola had allegedly bought votes. Some within the political establishment believed that in the interest of fairness, he should be compensated for his campaign expenses and persuaded to withdraw from politics. On June 21, 1993, Justice Dahiru Sali of the Abuja High Court voided the election despite an appeal pending at the Court of Appeal. 2 days later, on June 23, following a nocturnal military meeting at the presidential villa attended by Babangida's loyalists, informally known as the IBB Boys, a formal announcement of the annulment was made. Attempts at a negotiated resolution were dismissed in favor of outright cancellation. A state of military alert followed, and the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, toured military formations across the country to justify the annulment. However, this did little to quell discontent within the armed forces. According to Major General M.C. Ali, the then Director of Military Intelligence, many soldiers were deeply disappointed for three reasons. First, they resented the continued dominance of a small clique of officers who had held power since 1983. Second, despite Babangida's settlement culture, where material bribes were used to pacify dissent, many yearned to return to their professional military duties. Third, they were angered by the government's reckless deployment of troops to Liberia, where Nigerian soldiers were dying in droves without sufficient logistical support or national consensus. Yet, despite these grievances, command influence kept them from openly resisting the annulment. Meanwhile, security operatives intensified efforts to intimidate Abiola, constructing overt and covert threats against his life. In response, nationwide protests erupted, particularly in Lagos and other strongholds of Abiola's support. The situation escalated when General Abacha issued a chilling ultimatum to the Lagos State Governor, Sir Michael Otedola: restore order or face military intervention. Within 24 hours, Nigerian soldiers flooded the streets, indiscriminately shooting on unarmed demonstrators. Hundreds were killed on Abacha's orders. The military's popularity plummeted and officers began to fear wearing their uniforms in public. As the crisis deepened, former head of state Olusegun Obasanjo proposed a compromise. Babangida should establish an interim presidential council composed of former heads of states, excluding himself, to oversee a transition to a stable government. This plan retained democratic structures at the state and local levels, as well as the National Assembly, but placed executive power in the hands of an interim government. Babangida disliked the idea of an oversight body without him, but warmed to the concept of an interim national government (ING) as a potential exit strategy. A committee led by Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro proposed holding fresh elections under new rules before August 27, 1993. However, Babangida, seeing a trap, discreetly maneuvered to avoid this option. The SDP predictably rejected any calls for a new election, while Abiola remained steadfast in his refusal to surrender his mandate. Yet, through a combination of coercion and financial inducements, SDP leaders, including Chief Tony Aneni and Alhaji Sule Lamido, gradually distanced themselves from Abiola. By July 7, the SDP had reached an agreement with the NRC and Babangida to support an unelected ING, excluding Abiola entirely. This political realignment left Babangida scrambling to secure his own future. To retain influence, he sought to continue as Commander-in-Chief and Minister of Defense beyond August 27. However, having misled his military backers one too many times, he found himself increasingly isolated. The military factions that had brought him to power in 1985 no longer trusted him, nor did they trust each other. The divide between Babangida's personal ambitions and the agenda of the military establishment had become irreconcilable. To legally sideline Abiola, the regime unleashed a barrage of decrees, including Decree 39 Presidential Elections Repeal, Decree 40 Transition to Civil Rule Amendments, and Decree 41 Presidential Election Invalidation of Court Order. Several media organizations, The Punch, Concord Press, Sketch, Abuja Newsday, Ogun State Broadcasting Corporation, and The Observer, were shut down. On July 31, 1993, a tripartite committee comprising military officers, government representatives, and political party leaders was formed to salvage the transition. Notably, the military delegation included Lieutenant Generals Dongoyaro and Ali Gusso, while Abacha's allies were largely excluded. This suggests Babangida was attempting to marginalize Abacha, unaware that the latter was quietly consolidating power behind the scenes. Abacha played his cards carefully, allowing some overlap between factions. Brigadier David Mark, for example, was involved in both Babangida's and Abacha's groups, creating the illusion of a unified network. However, Abacha's strategy was clear: keep his enemies close, bide his time, and strike when the moment was right. As chaos engulfed the government, General M.C. Ali approached both the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Sani Ibrahim, and Defense Minister Abacha, suggesting a coup against Babangida. Both men hesitated, Saliu out of political caution, Abacha out of calculated patience. When Ali later revisited Abacha, he sensed that the latter had his own plan in motion, but preferred to let Babangida exit peacefully first. Meanwhile, rumors swirled of a personal rift between Babangida and Abacha, reportedly worsened by their wives' mutual dislike. With power slipping from his grasp, Babangida's last hope lay in persuading the National Assembly to grant him a continuing role in governance. This desperate bid failed, and by August 1993, his regime was doomed. As Babangida prepared to leave office, Abacha lay in wait, ready to seize control at the opportune moment. On August 2, 1993, the Chief of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Sani Ibrahim, addressed senior army officers in Lagos with a sobering announcement. Organizing a fresh presidential election before August 27 had proven unfeasible. Consequently, the government, backed by the two dominant political parties and foreign allies, had resolved to establish an interim national government to oversee governance and facilitate a transition. The assembled officers debated the nature of this transitional authority, considering options as a fully civilian government composed of members from the two parties, a mixed civilian-military interim regime, or an entirely military-led temporary administration. Ultimately, they agreed that General Ibrahim Babangida should not remain in office beyond August 27. A team of officers drawn from all three branches of the military and free from prior political appointments was tasked with charting the transition's details. Additionally, they recommended suspending the National Assembly for the duration of the ING's tenure and ensuring that the political parties sustained themselves financially. Curiously, this military-led consultation ran parallel to the deliberations of the tripartite committee, which had been set up to guide the transition. Meanwhile, on August 3, with threats both real and imagined looming over his life, Chief MKO Abiola, the presumed winner of the annulled June 12 election, departed Nigeria for Europe, having lost all hope of persuading Babangida to reinstate his mandate. By August 17, Babangida formally announced to the National Assembly that he was stepping aside. Notably absent from this declaration were his service chiefs, an uncharacteristic breach of protocol that underscored his waning grip on the military. That same day, as Babangida marked his 52nd birthday, senior officers from the Army, Navy, and Air Force convened in Lagos, reaffirming their stance that he could not continue in office. However, they refrained from appointing a successor or granting Babangida any role as commander-in-chief during the interim government. This omission, which he found deeply displeasing, played conveniently into General Sani Abacha's long-term strategy. To further institutionalize the transition, the government established the Nwambweze panel, led by Professor Ben Nwambweze, to draft a constitution for the proposed ING. Meanwhile, paranoia gripped the corridors of power. Officers who once roamed Babangida's residence freely, flanked by their armed security details, were now required to disarm before entry. Even Abacha himself experienced this tightening of security. With his options for a secure exit narrowing rapidly, Babangida settled on Chief Ernest Shonekan as the head of the ING. This choice was strategic. Shonekan, like Abiola, was Yoruba and hailed from Abeokuta in Ogun State. His selection was reportedly influenced by Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau and had the backing of the British government. However, the Nigerian military institution as a whole played no role in his appointment. Shonekan allegedly agreed to certain conditions before accepting the role. Chief among them was a commitment not to revisit the annulled June 12 election. Additionally, he was expected to discourage Yoruba unity on the matter. Strangely, it was also decided that he would not take up residence in the official presidential villa in Abuja, which was to remain vacant. Instead, he would be housed in the presidential guest house. In another confusing move, Babangida retained General Abacha as Secretary of Defense and Vice Chairman of the ING, ostensibly as a safeguard against coups and to maintain military cohesion. In effect, however, he had left the fox to guard the chickens. To counterbalance Abacha's influence, Babangida intended to appoint Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff. The arrangement positioned Abacha as the overseer of policy, while Dongoyaro would control operations. It was a dangerous balance, one Babangida had little choice but to accept, given his diminishing leverage. On August 26, 1993, a retirement parade was held at Eagle Square in Abuja for Babangida. As the ceremony concluded, the outgoing head of state, frustrated by the military's refusal to support his continued rule, announced the immediate retirement of all his service chiefs, effective from August 27. Those dismissed included Lieutenant General Saliu Ibrahim, Chief of Army Staff, Air Vice Marshal Femi Dada, Chief of Air Staff, Vice Admiral Preston Omashola, Chief of Naval Staff, Vice Admiral Murtala Onyako, Deputy Chief of Defense Staff, and Inspector General of Police Alhaji Aliyu Atta. In their place, Babangida appointed Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff. Later that evening, the Director of Military Intelligence, Brigadier General M.C. Ali, met with Abacha in his quarters. Ali advised that rescinding the service chief's retirement might help stabilize tensions between the military, Babangida, and an increasingly restive public. Abacha, ever the strategist, listened carefully before urging patience. Military authority must be consolidated before further action, he advised. What Abacha did next was a masterstroke. The general called a meeting with the supposedly retired service chiefs, expressing sympathy for their abrupt dismissals. As a gesture of goodwill, he extended the official retirement date to September 17. The following day, with their newfound backing, he took an even bolder step. He backdated Babangida's own retirement from the army to August 26. This effectively nullified all decrees Babangida had issued on August 27, including the appointment of Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff. Having neutralized Dongoyaro, Abacha now turned his attention to reshaping the power structure. He argued that it was unfair for three key defense positions to be occupied by Northerners: himself as Secretary of Defense, Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff, and Gusau as Chief of Army Staff. He then offered the role of Chief of Defense Staff to Lieutenant General Oladipo Dia, a Yoruba officer from Ogun State, the same state as Abiola. This was a calculated move. A former confidant of Abacha later confided that he had little personal regard for Dia or Yoruba officers in general. However, appointing Dia served a greater purpose: isolating Dongoyaro, while simultaneously positioning himself to manipulate Yoruba political leaders. For the moment, the Yoruba strategy suited his objectives. Babangida's departure and Shonekan's accession were formalized through a series of decrees. Decree number 59 of 1993 marked the official end of the Babangida administration, while Decree number 61 established the ING. At approximately 3:30 p.m. on August 26, 1993, Ernest Shonekan was sworn in as head of state and president of the Interim national government by Chief Justice Mohammed Bello at the presidential villa in Abuja. Another crucial detail lay within Decree number 61. Abacha was explicitly named as Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and Senior Minister. In the event of Shonekan's resignation or any other untoward event, the decree granted Abacha the right to assume leadership. Essentially, the ING was born with Abacha already positioned as the inevitable successor, while Shonekan had no real authority over the military. Shortly after, in an attempt to signal a new beginning, the government repealed several military-era decrees. Yet, just 2 days later, the National Labour Congress (NLC) launched a nationwide strike in response to fuel shortages, foreshadowing the turbulent months ahead. Nigeria's transition, it seemed, was far from settled. On August 31, 1993, Ernest Shonekan addressed the nation, outlining his plans for stabilizing the country. He had already begun releasing key pro-democracy activists detained during the June 12 riots, including Chief Gani Faweyimi, Dr. Beko Ransom Kuti, and Mr. Femi Falana. Universities that had been shut down were gradually reopening, while efforts were underway to persuade the National Union of Petroleum and Natural Gas Workers (NUPENG) and the Nigerian Labour Congress (NLC) to suspend their industrial actions. To the military, he offered assurances of a phased withdrawal of Nigerian troops from Liberia. Yet, while Shonekan made these pledges, General Sani Abacha was already consolidating his grip on power. On September 3, 1993, he formally announced what he had been quietly orchestrating behind the scenes. He appointed Lieutenant General Ladipo Dia to replace Lieutenant General Joshua Dongoyaro as Chief of Defense Staff, while Air Commodore John Femi succeeded Air Commodore Nsekak Edwak as Chief of Air Staff. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusso remained Chief of Army Staff, and Rear Admiral Suleiman Seidu took over as Chief of Naval Staff. In a swift demonstration of authority, Abacha also instructed the military task force on petroleum to restore normal fuel supplies within 24 hours. 2 days later, the nation received grim news. 7 Nigerian soldiers serving under the UN peacekeeping mission in Somalia had been killed. This prompted a fact-finding tour led by Brigadier General Cyril Iweze. On September 13, Defense Headquarters issued a statement attempting to downplay the political implications of the recent military reshuffles. Colonel Fred Chijuka, the military spokesman, insisted that similar exercises were underway in the Navy and the Air Force. However, just a week later, Chijuka found himself announcing another wave of changes. New divisional commanders were appointed, and Dogoyaro was officially retired. Abacha's methodical dismantling of opposition within the military had begun. As a seasoned coup plotter himself, Dongoyaro likely recognized the unfolding power grab. Meanwhile, Shonekan's appointment had failed to achieve its intended goal of dividing the Yoruba political elite and diminishing the June 12 movement. Resistance to his leadership emerged immediately. His residence had to be guarded against arsonists, while the governors of Oyo, Ogun, Osun, and Ondo states publicly refused to recognize his authority. Prominent Yoruba leaders called for Yoruba politicians within the interim national government to resign. Legal challenges further weakened the legitimacy of the interim national government. Pro-democracy rallies resumed and the court became a battleground. In an attempt to pacify public anger, Shonekan, who had initially agreed not to revisit the June 12 annulment, announced on October 1 the establishment of the Mama Nassar panel to investigate the election crisis. Yet, even as this was happening, security forces continued to detain pro-democracy activists. By October 3, the crisis deepened. Members of the SDP serving in the ING threatened to resign, claiming they had only joined in the belief that the arrangement was meant to facilitate a palace coup against Babangida. Meanwhile, the National Assembly found itself entangled in a divisive debate over repealing the decree that had annulled the June 12 election. Both Shonekan and Abiola embarked on separate tours across the country, rallying support for their respective positions. Abiola took legal action, seeking a court ruling to declare the ING unconstitutional. Amid this political turmoil, accusations surfaced that Shonekan was attempting to bribe National Assembly members to secure legitimacy. Though there was no concrete evidence, the allegations further undermined his authority. Shonekan's attempt to assert control over the military rested largely on his close relationship with Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau. There were even unverified claims that both Gusau and Rear Admiral Suleiman Seidu had discussed the possibility of retiring Abacha, a move that, if true, would have been a bold but dangerous gamble. However, the reality was that all the service chiefs treated Shonekan with utter disdain. At the year's Nigerian Defense Academy passing out parade, not a single one of them accompanied him. Meanwhile, military officers were forming factions based on their allegiances to Babangida, to Abiola, or themselves. A powerful cabal, later known as Sani Abacha Lagos Group, emerged. This group often convened in Brigadier Magashi's guest house in Ikoyi. Between late August and mid-September, Abacha continued to consolidate his influence, effectively becoming the de facto commander of all the armed forces. He unilaterally announced new army postings from Lagos, bypassing Shonekan, who remained isolated in Abuja. The service chiefs, knowing they were lame dogs, made no protest at the blatant disregard for protocol. By September 20, when the new service chiefs assumed their roles, Abacha had successfully installed loyal officers in all key military commands. Officers with perceived ties to Babangida were systematically sidelined, first through reassignments to politically relevant positions and later through forced retirements. The purge extended beyond the military, affecting even the traditional rulers who had supported Babangida's reign. By this point, the fate of Shonekan's government had already been sealed. Abacha's final move was merely a matter of time. From the moment Chief Ernest Shonekan was sworn in as the head of the ING, the Lagos Military Caucus had already begun laying the groundwork for his removal. Within their ranks, nominations were put forward, and votes were cast in secretive meetings to determine who would lead the next regime. This clandestine selection process resulted in General Sani Abacha being elected by this self-appointed Military Electoral College to assume power as head of state, commander-in-chief, and minister for defense. Lieutenant General Adepodia was chosen as chief of general staff, surpassing Lieutenant General Aliyu Gusau, while Major General Abdulsalam Abubakar triumphed over Major Generals Edward Unima and Cyril Iweze for the position of Chief of Defense Staff. Brigadier later Major General MC Ali was informed that he was next in line for the role of Chief of Army Staff, a position previously held by General Gusau, who was thus sidelined from any significant role in the forthcoming administration. A similar fate befell Rear Admiral Suleiman Saidu, who was ultimately displaced as Chief of Naval Staff in favor of Rear Admiral Alisima Dueke, a move orchestrated by Brigadiers MC Ali and Aboki Abdullahi to maintain ethnic balance within the military hierarchy. While General Gusau voiced concerns that another military takeover could irreparably damage the armed forces, and General Abubakar questioned the urgency of removing Shonekan, the plots proceeded unhindered. Meanwhile, on September 24, just days after Abacha had solidified his control over the military, Chief Moshood Abiola returned to Nigeria from Britain. His arrival at the presidential wing of the airport was met with a massive crowd of supporters. Without even stopping at his residence, Abiola proceeded directly to Defense House in Lagos for a private meeting with General Abacha. Insider reports later suggested that both Abacha and Dia had actively encouraged Abiola's return against Shonekan's wishes. Shonekan, in the meantime, was beginning to embrace the trappings of power. With the encouragement of his inner circle, he started to assume the role of a legitimate head of state and attended international engagements. On October 7, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly, even as legal challenges mounted against his government for authorizing funds to NEC for new elections and for setting up a panel to investigate the annulment of the June 12 election. Public criticism was also growing. The legendary musician Fela Kuti lambasted Shonekan's administration as a neo-colonialist entity and a Western stooge. In an attempt to combat rampant corruption, Shonekan ordered investigations into financial irregularities across several parastatals, including the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation (NNPC), the National Electric Power Authority (NEPA), Nigeria Airways, the Central Bank, and the Customs Service. Meanwhile, Abiola called upon Nigerians to fast and pray for divine intervention in the nation's affairs. Later that month, from October 21 to 25, Shonekan attended the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Limassol, Cyprus. There, he faced a humiliating plea from the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Douglas Hurd, urging him to reach an accommodation with MKO Abiola, the unofficial winner of the poll. Throughout the summit, Shonekan was reportedly in constant contact with Abacha in Nigeria, anxiously seeking updates on the security situation. However, in a move reminiscent of his treatment of General Buhari in 1985, Abacha largely ignored Shonekan's frantic calls, dismissing his authority over military affairs. On October 21, in a bid to align himself with mainstream military sentiments, Shonekan announced plans to scrap the controversial National Guard, a decision that had already been recommended in a classified report prepared by Brigadier MC Ali's military caucus. On October 25, 4 members of the Movement for the Advancement of Democracy (MAD), led by Jerry Yusuf, hijacked a Nigerian Airways Airbus A310 bound for Abuja. The plane was diverted to Niger, where it was eventually stunned by Nigerian paramilitary forces. The crisis recalled Nigeria's only other aircraft hijacking, which had occurred in April 1967 during the build-up to the Civil War. By October 31, reports began circulating in the Nigerian press about influential figures pressuring the ING to dissolve all existing political structures, a recommendation eerily similar to that found in Brigadier MC Ali's secret reports. Shortly thereafter, political turmoil erupted in the National Assembly, culminating in the impeachment of Senate President Dr. Eyocha Ayu on November 2, spearheaded by pro-ING senators led by Chuba Okadigbo. Senator Ame Ebute was installed as the new Senate President, and broader preparations by the Electoral Commission, headed by Professor Okonuya, to hold presidential elections on February 19, 1994. Amidst these developments, Northern elders led by former President Shehu Shagari convened on November 6, 1993 in an effort to preserve national unity. They declared their support for the ING, reinforcing its role as a transitional government. Emboldened, Shonekan moved into the presidential villa in early November, a decision that went against his original agreement with his predecessor Babangida and further provoked Abacha, who was growing increasingly wary of Shonekan's confidence. On November 8, amidst declining global oil prices, Shonekan's government made the ill-fated decision to remove the petroleum subsidy, causing fuel prices to skyrocket from 70 kobo to 3 naira 50 kobo. The resulting economic shock triggered mass protests and calls for an industrial strike, setting the stage for the final collapse of his administration. Just 2 days later, on November 10, the Lagos High Court, presided over by Justice Dolapo Akinsoya, declared Shonekan's interim national government illegal. In her ruling, Akinsoya noted that Decree No. 61, the supposed legal foundation of the ING, did not exist, as Babangida had relinquished power the day before it was supposedly enacted. This legal quagmire played perfectly into Abacha's hands. As the crisis deepened, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi publicly called on Abacha to rescue Nigeria from a terrible political and legal impasse. Yet, Abacha, ever the master of patience and precision, waited until all obstacles were removed. On November 15, the Nigerian Labour Congress declared a nationwide strike, while the Senate launched hearings into Shonekan's unpopular fuel price increase. Finally, on the morning of November 17, 1993, Generals Sani Abacha, Oladipo Diya, and Aliyu Gusau, accompanied by truckloads of heavily armed soldiers, arrived at the presidential villa in Abuja. The military units, commanded by Colonel Lawan Gwadabe and Brigadier Bashar Magashi, both members of the Lagos group, secured the premises. Inside, Shonekan was summoned to a private meeting with Abacha. The conversation was brief. Shonekan, outmaneuvered and without military backing, resigned. Abacha had waited in the shadows for years, striking only when the moment was ripe. The next day, he dissolved the National Assembly, state governments, and local councils, replacing civilian governors with military administrators.
Consequently, the following decisions come into immediate effect. The interim national government is hereby dissolved. The national and state assemblies are also dissolved. The state executive councils are dissolved. The brigade commanders are to take over from the governors in their states until administrators are appointed. Where there are no brigade commanders, the commissioners of police in the states are to take over. All local governments stand dissolved. The directors of personnel are to take over the administration of the local governments until administrators are appointed. The National Electoral Commission is hereby dissolved. All former secretaries to federal ministries are to hand over to their director generals until ministers are appointed. The two political parties are hereby dissolved. All processions, political meetings, and associations of any type in any part of the country are hereby banned. Any consultative committee, by whatever name called, is hereby proscribed. Decree 61 of 1993 is hereby abrogated. A provisional ruling council is hereby established. It will comprise
By October 1995, the head of state announced a 3-year transition plan to civilian rule, but it never came to fruition. On June 8, 1998, General Sani Abacha died suddenly under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of authoritarian rule that shaped Nigeria's political landscape for years to come. And so, without firing a shot and a chilling display of military precision, General Sani Abacha seized control of Nigeria. But was his rise to power ever legal? The answer upon closer examination is an emphatic no. The very foundation upon which Abacha built his authority, the infamous Decree 61 of 1993, was already dead in the water. Justice Dolapo Akinsoya had ruled it null and void, declaring that General Babangida, having relinquished power on August 26, 1993, had no legal standing to enact such a decree. Yet, Abacha invoked this same invalid law to justify his claims as head of state. The irony, within 24 hours of seizing power, he discarded Decree 61 altogether, stripping away any pretense of legitimacy. General Abacha's rise was not a transition of power, but a well-calculated hijacking of the state. Consider the manner in which it all unfolded. Shonekan, already a weak leader without military backing, was confronted in his office by Abacha, Dia, and Aliyu Gusau, each with their own ambitions, yet only one with a definitive plan. Under pressure and without the means to resist, Shonekan resigned. But in the days leading up to the coup, the political landscape was already shifting, with military conspirators in Lagos and Kaduna silently mobilizing, ensuring that when the moment came, resistance was futile. Shonekan's fate had been sealed long before the final meeting in the presidential villa. And what of Aliyu Gusau, the chief of army staff? Once an influential power broker, he found himself swiftly outmaneuvered, tricked into participating in the coup, only to be forced into retirement almost immediately after. Abacha had no room for competing interests. This was a masterstroke of deception, one that secured his absolute control over the armed forces and the nation itself. Thus, Abacha's rule began as it would continue, shrouded in illegitimacy, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. His regime would go on to become one of the most oppressive in Nigeria's history, a dark era marked by political assassinations, human rights abuses, and corruption on an unprecedented scale. But his reign came to an end just as suddenly as it began, under circumstances as mysterious as the man himself. So, what really happened to General Sani Abacha on that fateful day in June 1998? How did a man who ruled with an iron fist meet with such a cheap death? You can check out the full story in our next episode.